Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining this webinar and launch of the Nordic report, Addressing Microplastics in a Global Agreement on Plastic Pollution. My name is Anna Meaas. I'm with the Norwegian Environment Agency, and I'm also the project manager for the Nordic Council of Ministers, our Vision 2030 project, the Nordic's driving force in fighting marine plastic pollution regionally and globally. We focus on events and studies and reports that contribute to global processes like the Global Plastics Agreement and also EU regulations. All our reports are easily accessible from the Nordic Council webpage, and more reports may also be found on the Marine Litter Hub. I think the links will be shared in the chat. Last spring, the second session of the 5th UN Environment Assembly adopted Resolution 14 End Plastic Pollution towards an international legally binding instrument. The resolution marked the start of a process to negotiate a legally binding international agreement to end plastic pollution. During the negotiations, delegates will have to consider microplastics to ensure the agreement achieves its ambitions. However, what does this entail in practice? NIVA researchers have looked into the current scientific backdrop and governance of microplastics. So this report will hopefully be widely read and give valuable input to ongoing negotiations. So in this webinar, we will get a presentation of the report by Idun Rognerud, researcher from NIVA. Then we will arrange for a panel discussion with excellent panelists with different shares in the plastic agreement. Alexandra Harrington, Daniela García, Guilberto Borongan, and Declan McAdams. After a Q&A, we will finish off with a closing statement by Hans Adam from NIVA and IKHAPP. But first, we will have a statement from Senior Advisor for the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment, Erlend Draget. He is Norway's designated national focal point for the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee for the Global Agreement on Plastics. So, welcome, Erlend.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for that introduction and overview of this this launch. Hi everyone. As Anna said, my name is Erlend Draget. First of all, I think I would just like to start by thanking NIVA for once again providing us with great advice and scientific insight into an area of plastics that we know too little about. We have been working on marine litter and microplastics, moving into plastics and a circular economy for many years, and we see that the scientific insight and the just the breadth of science being conducted in this space is growing year by year, which is very encouraging. But there's still major data gaps, major knowledge holes that we need to close to make sure that we eliminate the leakage on microplastics. So just want to thank NIVA for this great work in the ministry. We will review this report as we have done with the many others that you provided us with great interest as we continue to develop our positions. Just a few words from my side on the Nordic cooperation, which is integral and very important financing source and collaboration to bring forth these types of knowledge products into the space. We have been working very closely in the Nordic region since at least 2019 in regards to plastics, where the Nordic environmental ministers got together and wrote a declaration calling for a global agreement on then marine plastic litter, which was the first of its kind and was very important in driving the mobilization that ended with the adoption of the UNEA resolution in 2022. We have then followed up with a range of different reports commissioned by the Nordic Ministerial, the Nordic Environmental, the Nordic Council of Environment Ministers, I apologize. And this has been very important to drive our understanding and our development of positions. NIVA has provided previously a report on international sustainability criteria, which is also a very important part in solving the microplastics issue. So thank you for that. As I said, microplastics is very important for all the Nordic countries as well as Norway. We need to have a plastics treaty that is effective in closing those leakage points as well. This report gives us a good outline of the various categories of microplastics, which helps us think about what different types of measures that we need, in order to solve the different challenges that they pose. I understand that the categorization includes like plastic pellets, flakes, and powders, which is kind of the starting point of this life cycle that we're trying to do better for Norway. And I understand also in the report there is guidance and recommendations pointing to the need for better reporting in this part of the life cycle. We need more understanding of the production levels, the quality of these pellets, what the material composition, but in regards to the leakage of microplastics, we also understand that guidance on transport and management of pellets and flakes and powders is very important. There is interesting conversation on this in the IMO, and this is certainly an aspect that we need to get into in the INC to look more closely at what the Plastics Treaty will do about this issue. Additionally, intentionally added microplastics is also an obvious candidate for something that we may do without. We in Norway will advocate for certain phase outs of certain plastic polymers, certain chemicals of concern, and also certain plastic products. And certainly some of those plastic products that have intentionally added microplastics might be candidates for phase out in our view. In the use phase, in terms of creating secondary microplastics, there's a lot of things that we can do in the design phase of both polymers and products. This leads us to textiles and wear and tear of tires and many other issues, but it doesn't resolve all of the leakage stemming or creating secondary microplastics. We also have certain point sources of leakage that we also need to have clear understanding of how to avoid. So providing guidance and obligations to follow that guidance on certain point sources of leakage of microplastics, such as wastewater facilities and industrial facilities, is also necessary. As well as obviously guidance for implementing environmental sound management in final disposal of all types of plastics is necessary to close those leakage points. And lastly, on degradation-based microplastics, the legacy plastics that we find all over the world, it's certainly also a source in terms of the microplastics that we find in the environment is always a risk of deteriorating into microplastics and being carried away by ocean currents and winds. We need to prioritize those hotspots that is necessary to avoid that sort of continuous leakage and degradation. and find the right balance in what we prioritize in that regard. But also make sure that that legacy plastic that we do remediate from the environment is disposed of in an environmentally sound manner. So again, you're going to speak a lot about the issues of microplastics, so I won't spend any more time on that. But this is a very timely report. We have just finished our first meeting in the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee in Uruguay. We have, in that meeting, which I thought was a very good meeting, a very encouraging meeting. It was, as we expected, the first gathering of 150 countries, a couple of many hundreds stakeholders from all over the world coming and laying out their key asks for this plastics treaty, which I thought was very encouraging. Just from the time of UNEA till the time of INC1 in Uruguay, for instance, we have seen great movement in terms of recognizing the risk for human health posed by plastic pollution. At UNEA, there was great controversy in having clear references to the risk to human health posed by microplastics and plastic pollution, which made it difficult to have even a brief mention in the preambular section of that resolution. But then coming into Uruguay, we heard none posing any critical questions to whether or not this link was firmly established and scientifically established. But almost all countries that we heard in plenary said that this should be the objective with this plastics treaty, both to protect the environment, but also the human health from plastic pollution. And microplastics is obviously an integral part of the risk to human health. So I think and microplastics was also mentioned by many in plenary in Uruguay, and quite detailed in terms of the different types of measures that we need in the treaty to avoid this leakage, which is it's a very challenging task to avoid those certain types of those leakages, as we understand. I remember, for instance, the OECD Scenario 2060 report that projects a way of reducing plastic pollution by 80% or something along those lines by 2060. The reason it is not able to provide us with a scenario reducing fully or near zero is exactly those microplastic leakages, in which we may not have the technology to close off those leakage points, or we don't have the proper insight into develop those measures. So there is a lot of need for science and knowledge and innovation to make sure that we close those leakage points as well. So very timely report. I thank you very much. We have now a deadline of 10 February to provide written submissions from all countries that will be input to the Secretariat, that will develop a document that we will start negotiating on the basis of in Paris in May. Really looking forward to that. Then we will hopefully get into more detail in the negotiations. And that's why this report is very timely, very appreciated, and will make a big difference. So I thank you very much, and good luck with your the rest of your seminar and launch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erlend. So I'll take over from here. My name is Idun Rognerud. I'm a research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research, and I will be presenting the report that Erlend has so kindly introduced. So let's see. Wait. So while I have the honor today of presenting our report and the findings, I also want to highlight that this is a collaborative effort, and my colleagues, Amy Lusher, Rachel Hurley, and Eirik Hovland Steindal are also here with me today, and will also be available at the end of this session to help answer any questions that you have. So feel free to send any questions into the Q&A box at the top of your screen. I also want to highlight and thank the 21 members of our advisory committee who have so kindly read the report and provided input and guidance as we have developed this report. As we were working on this, and I've been working on this report now for the past year, a key priority for us has been to try to make this a reference point for the negotiators of the Plastics Treaty, both today and in the process towards the next INC meeting, but also at the later stages when we go more in depth and actually dive into the potential elements and control mechanisms and how they might work. So for those of you who have already visited the online version of the report, you will see that this is quite an extensive document, and we hope that it will provide a good reference for starting to think about microplastics under the treaty. So, as mentioned by Erlend, there's a need to consider microplastics under the treaty. However, when we talk about microplastics, it's not just one thing. These are very diverse pollutants. They can be composed of very different polymers, different additives, and they can also have different sizes and shapes. For instance, what we see and what is increasingly recognized is that if we are going to define microplastics under the treaty, we might need to have multiple inclusion criteria. And this is one of the findings of our report, because if we stick to the sort of traditional definition of microplastics, which would be plastic particles that are solid and smaller than 5 millimeters, we risk excluding certain types of small plastic particles, such as, for instance, microfibers that are commonly larger than 5 millimeters. Typically, they're long and very, very thin. And so we propose that a plastics treaty, if it includes a definition, to take heed from the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants and include multiple inclusion criteria in order to take into account the diversity of microplastics across multiple factors. But taking a step back, having sort of given a very quick introduction to what microplastics could be considered to be, why should we even consider microplastics and why is it important? As Erlend mentioned, the scientific backdrop here has expanded massively in the last 20 years from when the conversation of microplastics really started. And we see now that the annual releases of microplastics to the environment are expected to double by 2060 in a business as usual scenario. As we know, microplastics, as most other plastic materials, are highly persistent in the environment, which means that they take very, very long time scales to break down. Knowing that the releases are increasing and they're so persistent in the environment, we expect that unless we take action now, the amount of microplastics in the environment will continue to accumulate. And this accumulation of plastics in the environment and the fact that researchers are finding microplastics across all environmental compartments, so that means we have microplastics in our soils, in our air, in fresh water and marine waters, and microplastics are found basically in all parts of the world and the most remote regions of the world. And this persistence and presence of microplastics everywhere is also translated to our daily lives. We find microplastics in the food that we eat. Researchers have found microplastic particles in blood samples from people. So we interact with microplastics also in our everyday life, and there's an increasing concern that this might pose risks to both human and environmental health over time. However, at this stage, we do not have sufficient information on the exact hazards associated with microplastics. However, the fact that the concentrations are continuously increasing gives rise to an argument that microplastics could be considered non-threshold contaminants. And these are contaminants for which we cannot identify a safe level of emissions because for two reasons. The one reason being that the diversity of microplastics makes conventional risk assessments very challenging, but also because the accumulation of microplastics in the environment means that at some stage, unless we reduce emissions, we will breach any threshold that is set. So that being said, why do we need to think about microplastics in a global agreement on plastics pollution? And here, I think there are three main reasons that we highlight in our report. The first is the transboundary nature of microplastics and microplastics pollution. As microplastics are transported by air, waters, and also in soil, they may often end up in environments far removed from where they are released. And this transboundary factor means that we need global and international cooperation to stem the leakages of microplastics. There's also the need to avoid unintended consequences and negative trade-offs for any measures imposed in order to prevent plastics pollution as a whole. And a common example of this is, for instance, the previous attempts to introduce oxo-degradable plastics, so plastics that degrade when exposed to the sun, as this was lauded as a potential solution to plastics pollution. However, as we learned more, we also learned that these materials do not actually fully degrade, but actually break down into smaller plastic particles that are even harder to clean up. Additionally, the fact that microplastics pollution occurs across the entire plastic product life cycle, which means that we need to take a holistic approach. We need to consider the risks of microplastics leaking from the initial production of plastic pellets, flakes, and powders, and their storage and transportation, down to the design of specific plastic materials to reduce the likelihood of microplastics being generated from the use and the wear and tear of plastic products. And finally, as Erlend also mentioned, at the end of life and end of use of plastics and plastic products, we need to consider also how to prevent microplastics from leaking from mismanaged plastics and plastics that are already present in the environment, so legacy plastics. It may be a bit hard to read the text of this graphic. However, you can find a higher resolution in the online report. The point that I want to bring across here is that microplastics, as mentioned, enter the environment from very diverse sources, from everything from the use of rinse-off cosmetics containing microbeads in our homes, to microfibers from textiles and the degradation of plastic products. But they also are released through specific point sources such as wastewater treatment plants and stormwater systems that might allow for measures targeting specific points and pathways that we can address. Furthermore, as we see microplastics move through our air, soils, and waters, they may also accumulate and create hotspots in the environment and in specific locations that might be far removed from where they were initially released. This is, for instance, the case in the Antarctic, where microplastics are trapped in ice and accumulated in ice sheets, as well as in the sediments and soils of riverbeds, in the vegetation where they may be trapped, as well as in the ocean gyres internationally. And so to tackle these diverse sources and these many different pathways, we need systemic interventions. But we also need to identify the most important sources of microplastics to the environment in order to enable us to prioritize any interventions under a global agreement. And so here, For us to prioritize action under the global agreement and to really understand and identify the dominant sources of microplastics, we do have an increasing amount of data. There's been monitoring efforts of microplastics in the environment now ongoing for more than 10 years, with countries such as China and South Korea having started national monitoring programs. There's also monitoring happening at the regional level through multiple regional seas conventions. And some countries have gone beyond just monitoring microplastics in marine environments, and also, such as in Norway, monitoring microplastics in soils and in airs. And indeed, in the recent findings coming out of the Norwegian monitoring program on microplastics, we found that microplastics were identified in every single sample taken, speaking to the proliferation of microplastics everywhere. However, when we're diving in deeper and trying to assess which are the most important sources of microplastics to the environment, while the leakage estimates that we have as of today are predominantly based on data from high-income countries, we still have grounds to assume that there are a few sectors that are particularly responsible for large amounts of microplastics entering the environment. These are the production and trade of plastic pellets, flakes, and powders, paints and paint fragmentation, tire and road wear, textiles, and the degradation of macroplastics in the environment. And a key point here to consider as we discuss the global agreement is the fact that the relative importance of these different sources will likely vary according to geography, according to the climate, the dominant industries, and socioeconomic factors in different countries. For instance, in countries that lack the institutional capacity and adequate waste management systems, it is likely that the degradation of macroplastics, so large pieces of plastics in the environment, will be a much more substantial source of microplastics to the environment. Meanwhile, for instance, in Scandinavia, rubber infill granules, so typically tires that have been ground, are commonly used, for instance, as infill materials in artificial sports pitches to allow for use of sports pitches throughout the year. And so understanding these regional and national variabilities in the most important sources will also be critical to enable us to design measures that are relevant and appropriate for the national and regional context. So in our report, we also dived deeper into the current regulation and governance of microplastics. I will not go into a high amount of detail in this presentation. However, there's a chapter of the report dedicated to this topic. But the main point here is really that we've seen quite a big uptick in the types and numbers of policies that have been introduced since 2018. We've seen that research priorities are shifting from simply documenting the presence of microplastics to starting to work on identifying the relevant and most important sources, but also potential solutions and regulatory measures. One of the most common policies are still the ban or the phase out of the use of microbeads in cosmetics. However, we're also starting to see increasingly measures addressing other sectors, such as mentioned in Scandinavia. There's increasing regulations on the use of rubber infill granules. And we also see changes and development of research agendas to also establish measures addressing, for instance, textiles and tire and road wear and so on. The EU is also in quite a unique position here, having gone for a rather ambitious target of reducing the microplastics emissions across the Union by 30% by 2030 compared to the 2016 baseline. And this might be part of the reason driving, especially within the EU, quite an extensive number of policies across sectors to reduce microplastics emission. Another country that another strategy that I want to highlight that might form an inspiration for future national action plans is California, the state of California in the US, which launched a microplastic strategy taking a two-pronged approach, prioritizing the simple fixes that can be introduced now to target known sources of microplastics pollution, while simultaneously establishing a research agenda to fill knowledge gaps and prioritize future action. So what we propose in this report is to take a source-oriented approach when considering microplastics under the global agreement. We, as Alan mentioned, we identify 4 broad categories of microplastics that might be suitable for different types of measures under the agreement. The first category being plastic pellets, flakes, and powders, so the raw material for the production of plastic products. These materials are produced for only to be traded, transported, and then used in production. And so it is fairly, or should be easier to implement measures that target specifically this sector. The second category is primary microplastics. So these are microplastics that are produced for the purpose of being very small pieces of plastics that are typically released after use. And common examples include microbeads. We have these rubber infill granules that you see in the upper right-hand corner, as well as also some types of agrochemicals. So for instance, some types of fertilizers that are covered in a plastic coating to allow for a delayed release of fertilizers or pesticides. The third category refers to unintentional releases of microplastics and stems from the use phase of plastic products. So here we refer to commonly textiles, tire and road wear, as pictured. Fishing gear can release fragments and fibers. And these types of microplastics will require different measures that might be more focused on the design of products, the phase down of products that are more likely to result in releases, and finally the degradation-based microplastics. So the microplastics that are produced from the degradation of larger plastic pieces in the environment. And here the most relevant measures might be related to improve waste management systems and environmentally sound management of plastic wastes, but also to reducing the production of unnecessary single-use plastic products, for instance, and generally reducing the use of plastics. So in the interest of time, I don't have time to go into a high level of detail here, but we do in the report highlight some of the most relevant measures that could be taken for each of these categories. So for plastic pellets, flakes, and powders, we see that commonly the releases here occur either directly from production facilities if they lack adequate filters and capturing methodologies, but also from the storage and transportation, both from diffuse accidental leakages, but also from large spills, such as the case of the Express Pearl disaster outside of Sri Lanka. And so here we propose in the report to develop best available techniques and best available practices for industrial facilities to prevent spills and leakages from facilities, as well as certification and chain of custody schemes. And here, for instance, Plastics Europe is one producer organization that is working on developing such a scheme, building on the voluntary initiative by the plastic sector called Operation Clean Sweep. When it comes to primary microplastics, we propose taking an essential and non-essential use approach, identifying the essential uses of primary microplastics. This might be, for instance, the use of some types of microplastics in medical appliances, where one would then choose to implement, for instance, restrictions on use, emissions regulations and guidelines, etc. Whilst for non-essential uses, phase outs, bans, and restrictions might be the most appropriate approach. When it comes to the use phase, it gets a bit more complicated. And here there are a broader suite of different measures that could be utilized, ranging from the bans and restrictions of especially problematic materials to establishing product design criteria and restrictions on use. One could also utilize labeling requirements, for instance, when it comes to paints, to make consumers aware of the fact that paints are, in many cases, composed of plastic polymers, as well as voluntary codes of conduct. And some have been suggested, for instance, in the case of the agricultural sector. And here, I think for the use phase especially, it's extremely important that the industry actors are involved in the design and development and identification of the best practices, guidelines, and standards. Finally, when it comes to the degradation-based microplastics, here taking a waste hierarchy approach, so prioritizing reduction, reuse, and recycling can contribute to reduce the amount of plastic materials that are leaked into the environment and otherwise mismanaged. We also do highlight some other measures that could be taken that you can read more about in the report as well, as I think I'll need to wrap up now. And so to conclude, our recommendations out of this report, some of the key issues that we want to highlight is the fact that microplastics should be included at an early stage of consideration for potential measures under the Global Treaty, both to prevent the risk of negative trade-offs, but also to ensure that microplastics are not simply treated as an add-on at the end. Global control measures should prioritize the largest sources and also take into account the cost effectiveness of measures. And additionally, one piece of work that could start now is to actually start developing work streams to identify best practices for different sectors, as well as best available techniques and best environmental practices. Similarly, starting to work to develop criteria for essential and non-essential uses of primary microplastics. And finally, establishing source inventories that will allow nations and regions to identify the most dominant sources within their jurisdiction can feed into the design of the national action plans if these are included under the Global Treaty. So with that was a very quick run through. Thank you so much. And I'm very much looking forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you so much, Idun, for this excellent presentation of a very, very comprehensive report. And I can only invite the audience once again to have a look at the actual physical report and download it on the link which is shared in the chat. And congratulations on this onto this multidisciplinary author team for putting this together and having this important piece of information out there in the public domain. So now we will move on to the panel debate. My name is Hans Nikolai Adam, and I'm a research scientist at NIVA. So I will be moderating this debate with a very distinguished panel of experts that come from different fields, from the scientific side, from the business side, from the civil society side, and from the policy domain. So let me just, before briefly introducing this panel, I think one person, Dr. Alexandra, was unable to join. Is she present? Can someone confirm that from Idun or Carolina? Not. She's not. Okay. So unfortunately, one of the panelists was caught up in train cancellations, I think, in the UK. So Dr. Alexandra Harrington, I think, was not able to join. So maybe she will join us along the way. But nevertheless, we can start with the panel that we have right here. So we have Dr. Guilberto Borongan, who is the director of the Regional Resource Center for Asia and the Pacific at the Asian Institute of Technology. And he has been working as head of the Waste and Resource Management Cluster and affiliated faculty at the Urban Innovation and Sustainability Department of Development and Sustainability at AIT. And he has been working on various aspects of waste management and environmentally sound management of waste and resource management, specifically in the ASEAN region. Then we have Mrs. Daniela García Freire, who's the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Mission of Ecuador to the World Trade Organization. And Ecuador, of course, holds a very important place in this dialogue as a co-chair of the WTO dialogue on plastics pollution. And they will also chair the bureau of the second half of the INC process, which is supposed to be scheduled for 2025. And then we have Mr. Declan McAdams, who's the chairman of a private company called Pinovo. And Pinovo is part of an interesting coalition that is set up by the WWF and EMF, which have endorsed a global vision on a plastic treaty, where basically the business works together to develop technologically sound solutions. In this case, they have developed an abrasive blasting solution that ensures zero pollution and zero damage from microplastics. But Mr. McAdams, I'm sure, can talk a little bit more about this kind of industrial technical process, which they have also developed. So let me start, first of all, by inviting all of you to briefly share your reflections on the microplastics report and some of the conclusions that have been presented by Idun and some of the recommendations. So maybe we can do it, I think we can have 3 minutes, 3-4 minutes each. To briefly share some of your reflections. And I can see, I just start randomly from the top of my screen, Mr. Declan McAdams. Would you be willing to start and share your reflections?
Of course, thank you very much. Firstly, I would like to welcome strongly this report. I think it's an excellent and timely document, particularly because I think it puts the issue of microplastics on the agenda in the negotiations. There is a risk that, not in any way understating the problem of plastic packaging, single-use plastics, etc., we must recognize for all the reasons valuable document. I think the issues lie around the issue of definition and the challenge of not being too precise, and that was highlighted. The fact that this is a moving target. Practically every week we have new science which shows microplastics found in different places, the quantum of microplastics from different sources. For example, Julien Boucher's work from 2017 was cited identifying the sources of ocean microplastics. He effectively brought the tire companies to the table in 2017-18. Last year, he produced a report with his team on the issue of paint, which has highlighted paint as being the biggest source of microplastics in the oceans. I think I also share the view that a focus for that reason on sources and not just a precise scientific definition is important, because this will direct where the effort should be placed. Because let's tackle the big issues. And let's not make perfect the enemy of good. We have enough information to take action. Let's not fall into the risk of paralysis by analysis, to use yet more cliches. And lastly, I would say, I think I'm a firm believer, and this was an issue that was raised earlier, that if regulators and this important UN treaty signals the direction of travel on regulation, then capital and industry will follow that direction and will find solutions. So I think the treaty and a document such as the one that's been produced by NEVA is an excellent way of directing industry's attention to where the solution should be created. Because as highlighted earlier, not all the solutions exist today, but they can and will be developed if regulators show the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Declan, for these very, very precise reflections and warning also against the paralysis by analysis, which is, of course, always a tricky process when it comes to scientific research. I mean, when is it enough and when should we move towards action? Yes, and we can come back to some of these points actually later on. But before that, can I invite Daniela to go next? Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hans, and I want to thank you all for this kind invitation. congratulate this effort, this collaborative effort from a group of experts, scientists, and policymakers to deliver an excellent report, which is granular and relevant, timely to this urgent problematic, and that's what we need for the negotiations. Ecuador is committed to end plastic pollution, and we're confident that the task that has been trusted to the whole international community to have an ambitious treaty is possible if we work together with determination and responsibility. It's a fact, as it was mentioned, that millions of tons of plastics pollute oceans, mountains, cities, soils, and impact ecosystems and human health. In a few years, there will be more plastics than marine life in the oceans. That's really worrying. And we will add additional tons of microplastics to our soil, on which our food security depends. And that's another very worrying fact. Scientific studies conclude that microplastics are particularly harmful to human and environmental health, plants and animals. And recently, the scientific community has confirmed the presence of microplastics in human blood, lungs, liver, brain, and even breast milk and placenta. We have heard all of this, and certainly it just makes us just makes more urgent our task to deliver an ambitious and effective treaty, but also to be to make use of this important information and work with the scientific community to inform our negotiations. So, as I mentioned, thank you very much for this report. Going to the question, I really want to start to saying that I recommend every government to go over the whole report, which is granular, and as I mentioned, that's what we need. With their departments of environment, but also health, trade, and agriculture. It's certainly a complex and a joint task that we should we should continue doing. Given the time, I will comment some of the findings and recommendations that capture my attention, the particular nature and diversity of microplastics, their pathways and impact, but also its sources. These to be taken into consideration in the treaty to identify, to better identify the presence of microplastics and, of course, effective measures. Idun mentioned POPs in the Stockholm Convention can be a good example on how to capture this particularity when we address the negotiations of this treaty. Focusing on microplastics, from the report, focusing on microplastics call us to look beyond the sectors that match that have been where the plastic discussion has revolved around. So we need this make us look beyond and we need to focus also on tires, clothing, textiles, paint, as well as packaging that has attracted so much attention now. And another fact is that existing data on microplastics presence and sources is not enough, although it's increasing, and it might only represent a point of the iceberg of the whole panorama of this problematic. So in terms of pathways, we're usually focusing on pollution in the marine environment. The report is great. It's also focuses on the attention on the contamination, the pollution, and the impact of microplastic in soils, and therefore the presence of microplastics in the food and the whole food life cycle, and the importance of and this portrays the importance of identifying measures to limit microplastic pollution under the treaty with the precautionary principle, prevention and polluter pays principles to the core, as also cooperation and coherence when we talk about measures. Just to finalize, I will go over going to other reflections after, but Erlend, Idun, but also Declan, you mentioned the importance of different measures, criteria, bans, prohibitions, depending on the nature of the material and product, activity, functionality, but also the pathways and the sources. So this is a very complex issue, and it has been great to look into the importance of every control measures in accordance to every specific criteria, types of plastic, microplastic, the impact, and so on. As I mentioned, my colleagues already elaborated on this, but the research shows that we need to do more, and we certainly need these kinds of reports to advance our negotiations. And as we approach INC2, it is a great way to start thinking about and taking from the report the control measures that would be useful to portray elements to fight plastic pollution when we talk specifically about microplastics and so on. And thank you very much. Again, I have other comments as well. It has been great to go through all of the reports, and thank you very much again for this invitation. And I'm honored to be surrounded by experts as you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for these reflections that touched on various elements of the microplastic problematic, so to speak. I'll just quickly go on also to Dr. Guilberto. Please, if you would also like to share your reflections.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans. First of all, congratulations for this milestone, if I may say, keystone report that you produced. So my reflections on the report is that the report provides a thorough and compelling, perhaps not to overlook, case on how to address microplastics in global agreements. In my view, this report also provides a valuable insight, as presented earlier, in a simple to understandable format to provide reference and key perspective to relevant stakeholders. And as mentioned earlier, also especially important also for the negotiators or delegates in the INC. Now, regarding the information and knowledge, they are well packaged and presented with interesting insight. Also, you can see there solicited from existing knowledge. And there's foreseeable interest areas also. And challenges can arise perhaps from their potential emissions, especially in our region. This, I think, is one of the key relevant offerings of this report that perhaps can be supported, and this contribute as a valuable reference on how microplastics may be addressed under the treaty, under the negotiations that's in place now and throughout, which is still ongoing. Yes, that's my inputs to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guilberto. And I mean, before moving on to the open questions from the audience, and please, from the audience, if there's any question that you have, please put it into the Q&A chat box, and we can come back to them after a few minutes. So please feel free to ask any question, and we'll pick and see what we can manage in the next 20 minutes. And maybe one follow-up question to Guilberto, since you have been working a lot in the ASEAN region and in a geography that has a lot of attention for waste management efforts, but also as a major source of what is called marine litter. How do you feel this focus or this additional focus on microplastic is in a way compatible with existing efforts to mitigate waste management? And the reason why I'm asking this question is that some of the steps that need to be taken regulatory, policy-wise, technological-wise can be quite resource intensive, as we can gauge from the report. So would that be a kind of competition with existing waste management efforts? Because even they are challenging. Even very basic waste management in many parts of South Asia, Southeast Asia are challenging already. So kind of now we put microplastics on top of it. So are they kind of complementary, or is it, I mean, what is your kind of take on this synergy between existing waste management and now microplastics as an additional component?
Thank you very much, Hans. From my experience on the ground, especially in the ASEAN, for many countries in the ASEAN member states or perhaps in Asia that we have projects with, the treaty will open perhaps windows of opportunity to empower and strengthen governance and mechanism to address microplastic, which is perhaps like aligned with the global efforts. Of course, we see low capacities and resources to monitor microplastics in the environment, which is among some of the predominant challenges faced by the low or medium income ASEAN or Asian economies in our region. Perhaps effective plastic waste management system to address, for example, the degradation-based microplastics are inadequate still. And additionally, establish support systems for policy implementation or research may perhaps boost the monitoring and assessment of key sources, as mentioned earlier, including pathways of microplastics in the environment, which is very critical for many developing economies in Asia. So this could perhaps strengthen knowledge building to relevant stakeholders in our region. Yeah, and perhaps and beyond. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Guilberto. And Declan, you have an immediate comment. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Hans. I would suggest respectfully that there's an opportunity in the UN treaty to touch on a subject which can't, for example, be dealt with by the EU Commission in their upcoming work on EU microplastics. And I take a specific example. We are aware of shipping companies that send their ships to Asia for dry docking, very often not necessarily assuring that they have the same high standards of surveillance on collection of paint microplastics during that dry docking that they would require if they were to do the same work at base in Europe, for example. You are also aware of these awful scenes where ships are sent and beached in Bangladesh and other countries in Southeast Asia with terrible human and environmental consequences. I think this is a wonderful opportunity in this UN treaty to deal with an issue like this, where bluntly Western companies are exporting their pollution to the East. So this is something that could not be dealt with in more regional agreements.
Yeah, thank you, Declan, for really highlighting, moving beyond the regional. And I think this is very much at the core of also the microplastic and the UN treaty negotiations, where partial efforts need to be replaced by something which everyone can kind of take precedence to. And actually, Daniela, since you have been working also with the WTO processes and these global processes, I'm just wondering if you can also maybe complement towards this larger question, also in terms of the WTO and the UN Treaty on Plastics. Is there any synergies that you see or any kind of, I think both Guilberto and Declan emphasized the opportunity aspect. And is there something which you feel that you can complement here when it comes to the WTO?
Thank you very much, Hans. And yes, I have two hats now. I'm part of the negotiator team of Ecuador for the treaty, but I am also coordinating the dialogue on plastic pollution in the WTO. So that gave us, as governments, we need to work in every front. And of course, the treaty being the main objective, we see a lot of value in terms of the WTO, but also other agencies and specialized organisms to contribute to this to the negotiations. And in terms and just as we were speaking, and after reading the report with such great best practices, at the end of the day, many of the things are trade related. When we talk about microplastics, the Microplastics EU directive is trade related. It has been notified to the WTO when we talk about the Technical Barriers Committee. And it is, and so on. I can see, I checked the notification database before participating in this, before coming to this, virtually to this event. And there are a variety of measures implemented in terms of microplastics to regulate microplastics. When we talk about cosmetics, when we talk about tires, when we talk about and others, and when we talk about marine environment, there are some. There are many from developing countries. They are increasing and recently notified since last year. So that gives us an idea that this issue is being addressed by governments, and of course it needs to go. It needs to be addressed, and experiences can be exchanged. When we talk about trade, trade is not the system. The multilateral trade system is not an obstacle to implement these measures, and we can see they have been implemented as long as they are non-discriminatory and based also in information and national consultations. So that makes the policy even more relevant, because it needs to be implemented for all endings, and of course according to the and of course take into consideration the impact on environment and health. So what we have been trying to do in the dialogue on plastic pollution, and actually the dialogue on plastic pollution, the ministerial statement that comes now with 75 members, we address the issue of microplastics, and we address the issue of human health in our statement. And one of the efforts in one specific conversation and discussion that we have, it goes to to reduce harmful and unnecessary plastics. And when we talk about harmful and unnecessary plastics, of course, we talk about microplastics and its sources. But we also talk about sustainable and effective alternatives. And this is another very important point that the report goes into the importance of not creating spillover effects, but also the importance of not creating other problems. So when we talk about alternatives, also looking in terms of production and standards, design, but also the materials we use for these alternatives to be viable in terms of effectiveness, but also and mainly in terms of environment. So we are a dialogue that is has environmental objectives. And of course, we see trade as a tool to exchange information and to contribute. I mentioned the importance of data that the WTO and the system has, the importance that is the first dialogue together with another dialogue that is co-chaired by Canada and Costa Rica. Our dialogue is co-chaired by Australia, Fiji, Barbados, Morocco, China, and Ecuador. And the importance of these two dialogues is those are the first in the WTO to have stakeholders. So we work a lot with many of the stakeholders that have collaborated in this report. And that's a contribution. Data, transparency, we have seen, we know the importance of working, for example, with the World Customs Organization to better identify ways to identify products, the importance of working on standards also in terms of services. When we talk about recyclability, for example, services are trade related, and standards should be trade related as well when we talk about the criteria that should be used. And sorry, there is a lot of information, and of course the cooperation, our main a very important part of our declaration and our work plan refers to the work of the INC. And even before the resolution was adopted in March last year, our statement had the resolution on it. So this is a group of countries, and it really shows that many communities, including the trade one, is very concerned about this issue. Okay. Stopping there. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. No, thank you for being very detailed about some of the kind of tools which trade and which they are opening up as well in terms of generating standards, promoting a shift towards different materials. And of course, this is, there's an economic component, of course, which is very much underlying in terms of any shift towards circularity or, more sustainable plastic products. Let's just maybe handle a little bit of the audience questions. So let's just start with, there was one question by Jeffrey or Kim. And the question is, how will the proposed treaty interact with the efforts in the International Maritime Organization to address plastic pallet carriage conditions in container ships under MARPOL? So that's a very specific technical question, and I'm not sure if there's anyone from the author team who would like to respond to this.
Yeah, I can respond to this. So we haven't gone into depth in the report on the interlinkages with the IMO, partially because this is in the IMO, the negotiations on the handling and transportation of the plastic pellets and whether or not plastic pellets should be considered hazardous are ongoing. So I think it's important not to predetermine or to make assumptions about what is going to happen under the IMO, and to continue the work under the Plastics Treaty to make the measures there as good as possible. That's my quick answer, but I think it's something to keep in mind that one needs to follow both processes.
Thank you, Idun. And actually, there's immediately a follow-up question also, which was specifically directed to you as well. And it was regarding agricultural plastics. And the question was about the slide when agriculture was mentioned at the first place as a source. So is agricultural plastics the main source for microplastics? And is there any kind of specific remediation or recommendations to address microplastics from agriculture?
Yeah, I think I'll hand that question over to my colleague Rachel, who's the resident expert on agricultural plastics.
Okay.
Hi, yes, I can give a brief answer to that question. I think the slide where the sources were listed was not necessarily ranked per se, and there are many different sources that are important for different areas around the world, and as Idun mentioned earlier, related to, for example, different climate conditions, local environments, different dominant local industries, for example. It is likely that agriculture is obviously a very important source for some regions, particularly in soil environments and areas in which agricultural plastics are used, different agricultural plastic products are used, and also, for example, sewage sludge application to land or the use of different compost products. In terms of possible remediation recommendations, this then fits into the different kind of source-oriented approaches that Idun mentioned when she was presenting the report, which are obviously elaborated a little more in the report itself. So looking at the different types of sources that deliver these microplastics to soil environments or environments where agricultural plastics may be used, or that the waste is handled or mismanaged in different ways. So this would relate to, for example, the breakdown of the plastics in the use phase related to degradation of agricultural plastics during their use, the breakdown of agricultural plastics during this waste mismanagement that would then obviously fit into the degradation-based microplastics, and then also the primary microplastics that then address some specific subtopics as well. So in this topic, we would then need to look at these different source-orientated remediation recommendations.
Thank you, Rachel. And in fact, I mean, I guess are kind of continuing on this line as well in terms of the questions. One question from Steve was regarding regulatory systems for the first major category of microplastics, which is the production and trade of plastic pellets, flakes, and powders. So are there any effective regulatory systems for that? And specifically, what is the role of voluntary measures like Operation Clean Sweep, which one of the panelists mentions? So can you comment on regulations? Is there anyone who would like to take that part, and especially the voluntary regulation aspect? Have they worked, or are they working? Are they promising?
Yep, I'm happy to jump on that horse as well.
All right.
Yes, so we do touch on this a little bit in the report. In chapter 4, we discuss specifically both diffuse and acute pollution from plastic pellets, flakes, and powders. I think the most well-known scheme is the Operation Clean Sweep, which is a voluntary scheme typically managed by producer responsibility or producer organizations for plastics polymer producers. This scheme does typically asks the different plastic producers and handlers to pledge to prevent pellet losses. However, there's no compliance mechanisms, few reporting requirements, etc. So we do see that there's, there are really good guidelines and best practices that have been developed. It does appear to be a need to further institutionalize this and actually have more of a ensuring compliance with the pledges. And this is also why, for instance, the EU is working on developing and sort of pushing for a certification scheme. We've also seen that in France, in 2021, a decree was introduced which requires producers, handlers to have first annual, and then I believe tri-annual inspections to ensure that best practices are actually implemented. And then I would also just mention, in terms of voluntary approaches, that there's also the case of Operation Clean Sweep being introduced in Brazil, where the scheme has a higher requirements to the producers in terms of reporting on how they implement it. So I think there's a lot we can learn, and Operation Clean Sweep and voluntary approaches are very important in terms of showing what is possible, but that there might need to be a bit more push as well to ensure implementation across all stakeholders and all actors in the value chain.
Thank you, Idun. Maybe we have time for one more question. I don't know if there was, or if there's any reflection also on this question from the panel. Please feel free. I just move ahead with reading out the last question, or I'm not. It's a very long comment / question, so I will just paraphrase it. And this is by Solomon. So what he is saying is that he specifically mentions the challenge of developing economies lacking resources and capacity to implement the provisions of for instance, of a climate treaty in practice and to the letter, and which is of course on account of the very expensive assessment methodologies, monitoring methodologies that need to be need a lot of resources. And this is kind of, I think, also a comment. And I'm wondering if one of the panelists would like to comment on that. Declan, you were nodding with your head to that question, or would you like to comment on this, or someone else? In terms of, I mean, it's a very big question, of course, in terms of it's a major issue, of course.
I mean, the only comment I would make would be, as coming back to something I said earlier about this question of responsibility, I think you have to try and find the sources of the pollution. This is one of the issues that was raised very well by Idun in the report, which is the challenge of monitoring. You can monitor and you can identify there are microplastics everywhere, but you can't extrapolate and say that gives us X amount. This is where I think the plastic footprinting work that has been done by people like Julien Boucher become interesting, where you can follow the path and then make the people who pollute responsible. So then you can find that if, for example, European shipping companies are pushing their ships to Asia and not ensuring the high standards that you would expect in the dry docks, that they are responsible for cleaning up.
Yes, that's of course a very, very key point as a polluter pays kind of principle, being able to be followed up and monitored and actually being held accountable. Yes, and is there, yeah, please, Daniela, you also had a comment.
No, thank you very much. Just mentioning, of course, the polluter pays principle is very important. When we also talk about one of the, as a result of the working, the informal group during the first INC in Uruguay, one of the issues was coming with a document including control measures, but also means of implementation. Means of implementation being crucial in terms of getting effective, but also ambition actions and measures, and just saying how important that's for developing countries. And when just the importance going beyond that, just sharing Ecuador, for example, just released after 10 years, one study about the presence of microplastic and its impact on the health of fish in the tropical Pacific region. This was after 10 years, and it was only possible with the collaboration of the Atomic Energy Agency, other agencies, and the Fisheries Institute of Ecuador. So that's the importance of international collaboration and cooperation is instrumental if we want to go beyond the data, the presence of microplastics that going beyond to problem, to the impact, and of course then with a mind of problem solving when we present a solution. Just stopping there, but of course means of implementation, it's important, and going beyond the presence, the data on presence of microplastics, but also impact and having a problem-solving mind and international collaboration on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. And I can see that Eirik, one of the co-authors of the reports, Eirik Steindal, has also raised his hand. Please, Eirik, go ahead.
Yeah, just a short remark concerning this question. I just wanted to add that looking at other previous environmental treaties, one of the benefits with this global process now is that it releases and triggers financial mechanisms for developing countries and economies in transition to make this inventory and mapping of sources and also environmental monitoring. So there is a lot of things being triggered from the Minamata Convention. There was also this Minamata initial assessment. So countries were supported making an early inventory of different sources. And I think this is something that could be considered also in the plastics treaty. So I'm sure this will be discussed. So just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eirik, for pointing towards that direction as well. And I can see we also have quite an active chat where a lot of resources are being shared in terms of some of the voluntary corporate pledges and commitments and how they are part of the solution. How they can be part of a solution when it comes to preventing plastic pollution. But we are now slightly over time, but basically still in time. And so I will end this webinar in a bit. So first of all, thank you so much to all the panelists for your excellent feedback and for your time and expertise. And of course, to the author team around Idun, Eirik, Amy, Rachel, and the author team from NIVA for producing this excellent report. And also to the team from IKHAPP, who have been actually organizing this webinar and who maybe can briefly switch on their cameras, Carolina and Dia, who have been doing a lot of work on the side, of course, in terms of organizing this webinar. So thank you so much for that. And of course, to the audience. I think we had more than 90 people throughout this webinar, which speaks to the importance and interest that this subject has garnered over the past few years. And I think what we can take away also from this discussion and from the report is that microplastics is a relatively new object of concern, but at the same time, there has been sufficient scientific evidence to document a certain adverse impact. And I think this goes back to Declan's comment about not to be stuck in paralysis by analysis, but moving on towards action. And of course, this is then when we move into the policy sphere, into the trade sphere, and also into the scientific sphere that supports this process. And I would also like to highlight and point out to the audience to have a look at the IKHAPP webpage, the knowledge platform which has been co-hosting this webinar. So the International Knowledge Hub Against Plastic Pollution, which you can see upside down next to me, is basically composed of a community of scientists which tries to engage in debate, disseminate knowledge, critically analyze it, and make it available to the public domain. So it's an open platform that all of you are very welcome to join. So then you can receive updates through the newsletter and also upcoming events that go more into specific topics that we also touched upon today. For instance, if it's the agriculture plastics, if it's the informal sector, if it's the international negotiations. So there's a lot of events where we invite multi-stakeholder audiences and panelists to discuss key topics of concern. And basically the idea is that science should not be science in its own right, but it should support processes for positive change. And basically this is, again, an open platform where we invite all of you to also participate, join, and share. So with that, I thank all of you for joining today. And I wish you a very good afternoon, evening, and I don't know, maybe some of you also in the morning, those joining from North America.